The screen door of the trailer groaned on its hinges as Margaret stepped onto the porch. But the sound was instantly swallowed by a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. On her doorstep lay a faceless doll, woven from dead grass, its limbs twisted into impossible angles, smelling of burnt sulfur and old coal dust. As she reached down, the figurine began to char from within, turning to fine black soot before her fingers could even brush the stalks. From the direction of the abandoned mines, a low, vibrating hum rose through the soil, a chorus of voices singing a miner's hymn that hadn't been heard in a century, though not a single leaf in the forest moved to the sound. Deep in the woods, the usual chatter of birds and insects had vanished, replaced by a heavy, oily atmosphere that made every breath a struggle. Margaret found a young buck collapsed in a bed of ferns, its side torn open by jagged gashes that didn't bleed. Instead, the wounds pulsed with a rhythmic, blackened heat that mirrored the frantic beating of her own heart. Behind her, the rhythmic clink of a poacher's trap, snapping shut, echoed through the timber. But when she turned, the steel jaws were empty, coated in a shimmering, iridescent film. The woods weren't just dying. They were waiting, and the shadows stretching toward her home seemed to have finally found a way inside. Horror. The screen door of the trailer groaned on its hinges as Margaret Calloway stepped inside, shaking the damp from her sleeves. The scent of burnt coffee and stale cigarette smoke clung to the air, thick as the fog rolling off the river. Her fingers brushed the chipped edge of the counter, where a stack of unpaid bills sagged beneath a rusted can of beans. The radio on the windowsill hissed static between country songs, the voice of some long-dead singer warbling about lost love and cheaper whiskey. She didn't stay in the kitchen long. Her life was measured in the rhythm of the woods outside, not the ticking of a clock or the accumulation of debt. Leaving the trailer behind, she stepped into the dense underbrush of the eastern Kentucky hills, her left leg dragging slightly, a lingering protest from a fall years ago. The damp moss beneath her heavy boots swallowed the sound of her footsteps, acting as a velvet carpet that led her toward the sanctuary she had built with her own scarred hands. Upon reaching the perimeter of the enclosures, Margaret pressed her palm against the rough steel mesh of the primary enclosure. The wire was taut, holding firm against the weight of the wild. Inside, a red fox with a thick bandage wrapped around its foreleg jerked its head up, nostrils quivering as it caught her scent. Pine needles, wet earth, and the metallic tang of old blood. She moved with a predator's economy of motion, reaching out to straighten a lopsided feeder. She scraped away a thin crust of frost from the wooden edges, her rough fingers unfazed by the bite of the cold. The air carried the heavy, cloying aroma of decaying needles, a scent that usually brought her peace. Yet today, she found herself scanning the shadows between the ancient oaks. A strange disorder hung in the atmosphere. The usual chatter of the woods had been replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness that made the hair on her neck prickle. She wandered further toward the edge of her property, where the lush fescue usually gave way to the deep timber. Instead, she found a patch of dead, coal-black earth that looked like a cauterized wound on the hillside. In the center of this blighted circle, a poacher's trap lay open, its steel jaws grinning in the dim light. The springs were coated in a bizarre, iridescent film that shimmered like oil on water. Margaret reached out, her calloused fingers hovering over a blackened fern frond. At the slightest brush of her skin, the plant crumbled into fine, soot-like dust. The silence here was absolute. No cicadas buzzed, no woodpeckers drummed against the bark. It was a vacuum, a pocket of air stripped of life and replaced with a biting bitterness that stung her throat. The weight of the silence followed her back toward the small town, a necessary excursion to the local clinic. Inside, Mr. Lee, the veterinarian who had once been a friend, didn't look up as she entered. He was meticulously wiping his glasses with the hem of his white lab coat. The fluorescent lights overhead humming a low, irritating B-flat. Margaret gripped the edge of the laminate counter, her knuckles white. Behind him, rows of antibiotic vials stood like a glass army, gleaming with a clinical indifference. Mr. Lee finally turned, his finger tracing a long column of figures in a leather-bound ledger. The red ink beneath her name was thick, a triple underline that felt like a barrier she couldn't climb. He pushed an empty cardboard box toward her and shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin, apologetic line. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol and old paper, the ticking of the wall clock sounding like a mallet striking an anvil, counting down the seconds until her world collapsed. Returning home was no reprieve. She pulled a stack of mail from the rusted tin box at the end of the drive, her fingers trembling as she found a thick envelope bearing the official seal of the Commonwealth. The paper was heavy, resistant to her touch. When she tore it open, the jagged edge mirrored the state of her nerves. The bold letters at the top, notice of foreclosure and seizure, blurred into black stains before her eyes. The wind caught the metal door of the mailbox, sending a rusted screech echoing through the empty yard. Margaret leaned her back against a tilting fence post, the rough wood biting into her shoulder blades. The Kentucky sun felt pale and distant, providing no warmth against the cold fire of the document in her hands. As she reached her front porch, her boots hit the wood with a hollow thud. There, lying directly across the threshold, was a crude weaving of dried stalks. It was a doll made of withered grass, faceless and twisted, its limbs bent at impossible, agonizing angles. As she leaned down to inspect it, a sharp, suffocating stench of burnt sulfur hit her, making her eyes water. The air around the porch felt oily, thick with a weight that shouldn't exist in the open air. She recoiled as she noticed the grass of the figurine beginning to blacken, charring from some invisible, internal heat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, while a low thrumming began to vibrate in her ears, drowning out the familiar creak of her own house. Dusk brought no comfort. As the shadows lengthened into black columns that seemed to support the weight of the sky, a sound drifted up from the direction of the abandoned coal mines. It was a low, vibrating melody, a haunting resonance that Margaret recognized with a jolt of ancestral memory. It was an old miner's hymn, a song of the deep earth. But the voices didn't sound human. They sounded as if they were being filtered through layers of rock and silt, rising from the very soil beneath her feet. Cold sweat beaded on her brow as the singing grew louder, the lyrics about forgotten graves and the weight of the mountain becoming terrifyingly clear. There was no wind to carry the sound, no movement in the trees. The dead whisper of the mines simply enveloped her home, causing the window panes to rattle in their frames. The next morning, the physical world reasserted its hostility. Near the creek that bisected the lower valley, Margaret stumbled upon 3 men in mismatched camouflage. They were huddled over a series of illegal snares laid out on the flat stones of the bank. The largest of them, a man with a face like a slab of raw meat, stepped forward and spat a glob of tobacco juice near her boots. He gripped a heavy carbine, his eyes flat and devoid of anything but a dull, predatory malice. The air around them stank of cheap bourbon and unwashed skin. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her face, promising her that the next trap wouldn't be set for a 4-legged creature. Margaret clenched her fists, the icy water of the creek seeping into her boots, while the men's aggressive laughter tore through the fragile peace of the forest. Driven by a sudden, desperate need for contact, she rushed back to her trailer and grabbed the telephone receiver. but there was no dial tone. Instead, a dead, dry hissing filled her ear, a sound like 1,000 snakes slithering over silk. She ran to the backyard and found the line severed, the copper wires hanging from the siding like torn tendons. The atmosphere around the house had become so dense that every step felt like wading through knee-deep water. She tried to call out, to scream for someone, but the sound died in her throat, unable to travel more than a few feet in the oppressive air. Above, the sky had bruised into a sickly violet hue, and the familiar scents of the woods, the pine, the rot, the rain, had vanished, replaced by a sharp metallic tang that set her teeth on edge. The arrival of a black SUV broke the spell of isolation, though it brought a different kind of dread. Mr. Ward, a man whose suit was so perfectly pressed it looked like armor, stepped out into the orange dust of the driveway. He didn't look at the trees. He looked at his watch. He handed Margaret a leather-bound folder, his gold pen tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat against the cover. His eyes were calculators, cold and precise, seeing only acreage and mineral rights where she saw life. He spoke of progress and the inevitable march of industry, his voice nearly drowned out by the idling hum of the SUV's engine. Margaret looked at his manicured hands and felt a surge of hatred so potent it burned away the last of her fear. Nature itself seemed to be reacting to the intrusion. Later that day, she found a young buck collapsed in a bed of ferns. Its side was torn open with deep, ragged gashes, but the wounds weren't bleeding. The edges of the flesh were charred black, emitting thin, wispy trails of acrid smoke. As Margaret reached out to touch the animal, the black flesh began to pulse. She flinched, her own heart skipping a beat, as if syncing with the rhythmic throbbing of the deer's injuries. Every shudder of the animal echoed as a sharp pain in her own chest. The forest went silent, a gallery of trees watching the grotesque communion. When she pulled her hand away, her fingers were stained a deep, bruised color that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. Nightfall felt like a siege. Margaret slammed the heavy iron bolt home on the front door and yanked the heavy curtains shut. But the darkness outside felt physical, pressing against the glass. In the dim glow of her single lamp, she saw shadows beginning to seep through the cracks in the floorboards. Thin, elongated shapes that looked like skeletal fingers reaching for her. She could hear the scratching of hundreds of claws against the exterior siding, a frantic, rhythmic scraping that set her nerves on fire. Dozens of invisible eyes seemed to peer through the walls, their presence a heavy weight on her lungs. She pressed her back against the door, feeling the entire structure shudder under the silent pressure of the woods. Every creak of the house was a breath, every groan of the timber a whispered threat. By dawn, the threat had taken a mechanical form. Margaret stepped onto the porch, the cold steel of her old double-barrel shotgun resting against her shoulder. At the far end of the access road, the first yellow bulldozer of the mining company appeared, its massive blade screaming as it scraped against the limestone, tearing up great clods of turf and ancient roots. The vibration began as a low hum in the soles of her feet, a frequency that set her teeth on edge long before the sound of the drill truly took over. Margaret gripped a fence post, watching as the company's massive steel bore began to bite into the earth just yards from her property line. The machine shrieked, a mechanical banshee tearing through the morning air, and a plume of fine gray dust billowed upward like a signal fire. On the whitewashed siding of her clinic, a thin black line appeared. It crawled upward, branching like a lightning strike, the wood groaning as the foundation shifted. The roar of the engines was a physical blow, a constant pressure in her skull. As the plaster began to flake off the walls in white, ghostly scales, Margaret felt a deeper movement, a slow, tectonic grumbling from the dark spaces below. An ancient sleeper disturbed by the needle of the drill. She fled into the sanctuary of the owl enclosure, seeking the comfort of the familiar, but found only a new nightmare. Instead of the sharp, staccato hoots of the great horned owls, the air was filled with a low, vibrating drone. Her breath hitched as a snowy owl turned its head a full 180 degrees, its beak falling open. The sound that emerged wasn't a bird's cry. It was a long, rattling moan, a perfect, chilling mimicry of her own mother's voice in her final hours. The other birds on the perches began to sway in a synchronized, rhythmic trance, their throats emitting a chorus of sobbing and disjointed muttering. Margaret pressed her hands over her ears, staring into the dilated, obsidian depths of their eyes. They didn't see her. They were no longer birds. They had become hollow vessels for a subterranean grief that was now bleeding into the world of light. Sleep was impossible, but even her waking moments were fractured. She was jolted from a trance by the smell of something thick and oily, the scent of burning accelerant. Outside, the sky was a bruised, angry orange. She stumbled into the yard to find her main barn transformed into a pillar of fire. The heat was a solid wall, the air shimmering with the stench of kerosene. A trail of the fluid glistened in the grass at her feet, a rainbow-slick path leading back toward the road. The timber of the barn popped and cracked like breaking bone, sending swarms of sparks into the black sky. Through the roar of the flames, she could hear the panicked scratching of the animals trapped inside, their shadows dancing frantically against the burning walls. Without a second thought, she threw a damp piece of burlap over her head and plunged into the orange haze. The air was a furnace, searing her throat with every desperate gasp. She fumbled for the latches of the cages, her palms sizzling against the blackened metal. She dragged the whimpering foxes and hissing raccoons out into the smoldering grass, her skin blistering under the intense radiation. Just as she pulled the last cage free, a sound like a thunderclap erupted above her. She dropped to her hands and knees as a massive oak beam, weakened by the fire, gave way. It collapsed in a roar of sparks and ash, missing her by inches and burying the remains of the sanctuary under a mountain of burning debris. Driven by a raw, unrefined fury, she marched to the nearest neighbor's house, her face smeared with soot and her hands raw. She pounded on Mr. Smith's heavy oak door, leaving dark, greasy smears on the polished wood. When the door finally creaked open a fraction, she saw the glint of his eyes. Not with pity, but with a sharp, superstitious terror. He was clutching a heavy brass crucifix, holding it toward her as if she were a plague bearer. He didn't offer water or a phone. He spat accusations, his voice trembling as he told her she had brought this darkness upon them with her unnatural ways and her beast worship. The door slammed shut, the heavy thud of the deadbolt sounding like a coffin lid closing. Margaret stood on the dark porch, the silence of the valley now feeling like a physical weight. She retreated back toward the woods, wandering the edge of the tree line until she stumbled upon a new wound in the earth. A deep, jagged fissure had opened between the roots of an ancient ash tree. From the black maw of the crack, a thick, yellowish fog began to spill, smelling of stagnant blood and rusted iron. She leaned over the edge, and the sound that rose from the depths was a rhythmic, stomach-turning scrape, the sound of a giant file being drawn across stone. The soil beneath her boots felt wrong, soft and yielding like wet muscle. The fog curled around her fingers, leaving a gray, greasy residue that clung to her skin. The cold emanating from the crack wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was a void that seemed to suck the very warmth from her marrow. The law arrived not to help, but to finalize her ruin. Sheriff Miller's cruiser blocked the drive, but he wouldn't look her in the eye as he stepped out. He held a thick sheaf of papers with a cold, official blue seal, his hand trembling slightly as he avoided her charred fingers. His voice was a flat, rehearsed monotone as he read the order of immediate eviction, citing public safety and imminent industrial necessity. The wind caught the paper, flapping it against his uniform, but he just adjusted his heavy duty belt and turned back to his car. Margaret felt the legal system of the state tightening around her like a noose, even as the bulldozers behind the sheriff continued to grind the landscape into a flat, featureless gray. Then, the shadows began to change. From the dark, open maws of the recently unsealed mine shafts, ribbons of absolute blackness began to uncoil. They didn't move like smoke. They crawled like ink through water, defying the glare of the company's floodlights. The long, multi-jointed shapes slid up the yellow tracks of the excavators, coating the cabs in a substance that looked like liquid obsidian. Margaret watched a young worker drop his radio and scream, a sound that was cut short as he bolted into the woods. The heavy diesel engines began to choke and sputter, emitting thick clouds of black smoke in which Margaret could see the unmistakable outline of clawed hands. The metal of the machines groaned and buckled, as if being crushed by an invisible, immense pressure. She found the first body near a circle of dead ferns. It was one of the camouflaged men from the creek, but he was barely recognizable. His face was frozen in a mask of such profound horror that Margaret had to look away. His skin was a map of deep, dark furrows that looked like the grain of old wood, and from his eyes and ears, tiny, pale shoots of ghost-white moss were beginning to sprout. His clothes had rotted away to gray rags in a matter of hours. The air around him smelled of freshly turned earth and something sweet and cloying. The forest felt strangely sated, as if it had finally been given the payment it had been demanding for a century. As she crossed the threshold of her own home, the whispers that had been haunting the edges of her hearing exploded into a deafening, vibratory roar. The air itself began to shake with such violence that she felt it in the roots of her teeth. In the kitchen, the cabinets erupted. Her mother's old glasses and plates shattered into a million sparkling diamonds, peppering the floor. Margaret collapsed to her knees, her hands over her head, as the very walls of the house groaned under the sonic assault. Shards of glass bit into her palms, but she couldn't hear her own cry over the triumphant, cleansing scream of the woods. She looked toward the window, where a flickering, phosphorescent light was bleeding through the curtains. At the edge of her yard, where the porch light failed and the true dark began, hundreds of animals were standing. Coyotes, deer, foxes, and thousands of smaller rodents stood in a silent, unwavering line. Their eyes weren't reflecting the light. They were glowing with a steady, internal amber fire. They weren't looking at the house. They were looking through it, waiting for the moment the barrier between the worlds finally dissolved. The fog didn't roll in. It condensed out of the air itself, a thick, milky soup that tasted of wet stone and old pennies. Through the haze, Margaret saw 3 figures moving toward the house. Men in tactical gear, their silhouettes jagged with the outlines of rifles. They were coming to finish what the lawyers had started. The lead man held a white eviction notice like a flag of war, his heavy boots crushing the gravel with a rhythmic, military precision. Margaret watched them, her breath coming in shallow hitches as the smell of diesel and cold sweat began to permeate the room. The house felt fragile now, a balsa wood toy about to be crushed by the weight of the men and the fog. The first blow came from the bulldozer. The yellow beast slammed into the corner of the barn, and the impact traveled through the ground and up the foundation of the house. Margaret felt the floor tilt. The sound of the stone foundation cracking was like a bone snapping in a quiet room. dust rained down from the ceiling, coating her hair in a fine, white powder. The engine of the bulldozer was a physical presence, a hot, oily breath that seemed to be sucking the oxygen out of the room. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, feeling the timber vibrate with the machine's mechanical hunger. Outside, the shadows moved. Long, spindly shapes that had no business being in a Kentucky forest detached themselves from the trees. They flowed behind the mercenaries, silent as a thought. Margaret saw a black, multi-jointed limb reach out and touch the shoulder of the man in the rear. His camouflage jacket instantly turned white with a thick layer of rime frost. He didn't even have time to turn before the shadow pulled him into the mist. There was no scream, only the sound of a heavy boot dragging across the gravel, and then silence. The lead mercenary panicked. He spun around, his rifle spitting fire into the fog. The muzzle flashes were brief, strobing bursts of light that revealed nothing but the swirling white vapor. The bullets whistled through the air, hitting nothing but wood and leaves. Before he could reload, a tangle of black, vine-like appendages erupted from the ground beneath him. They wrapped around his ankles, pulling him down into the mud. Margaret watched his fingers claw at the dirt, leaving deep, frantic furrows before he was yanked backward into the darkness of the tree line. The only thing left was the sharp scent of ozone and the lingering heat of the spent shell casings. She ran to the front door, her hands fumbling with the heavy brass bolt. But the wood was already being hammered from the outside. A severed hand, still encased in a tactical glove, slammed against the window pane, leaving a long, dark smear of something that looked too thick to be blood. The liquid hissed against the glass, eating through the paint on the frame. Margaret scrambled back, her heart a frantic drum in her ears. The scratching on the door was no longer human. It was the sound of 1,000 needles trying to find a way through the grain of the wood. In the center of the living room, the floorboards began to groan and buckle. From the gaps between the wood, a cold blue light began to pulse. Figures began to rise, not solid, but made of a shimmering coal dust haze. They were the miners who had died in the 1920s, their faces hollow masks of soot and bone. They held spectral picks that glowed with a freezing, subterranean fire. The room temperature plummeted. Margaret's breath came out in a thick cloud of white vapor. The miners didn't look at her. They looked at the walls of the house as if they were the walls of a collapsing shaft. One of the figures swung its pick. The tool passed through her dining table without a sound. But where the spectral metal touched the wood, a patch of black, oily rot instantly appeared. The miner turned toward her, its eyes two pits of freezing blue flame. It saw her not as a woman, but as another obstacle in the dark. Margaret pressed herself into the corner, the cold from the figure so intense it felt like a physical burn. The miner raised the pick again, his movements slow and deliberate, a machine of ancient, forgotten labor. The house was being torn apart from both sides. Outside, the remaining mercenaries were using an axe to hack through the front door, their screams of terror blending with the roar of the forest. Inside, the floor was dissolving into a pit of black coal and blue light. A tactical axe head bit through the front door, the steel gleaming in the dim light. Through the hole, Margaret saw a man's face, his eyes wide with a madness that surpassed her own. Behind him, she saw the trees themselves moving, their branches reaching down like the fingers of a giant, to pluck the men from the ground. Mr. Ward was there too, trapped in the cab of his idling bulldozer. He was screaming, his expensive suit torn, as thick, pulsating vines of giant ferns burst through the floor of the machine. The plants grew with an impossible, visible speed, their thorns piercing the leather of the seat and the flesh of his legs. Margaret watched as the ferns wrapped around his throat, pulling him down toward the grinding gears of the machine's tracks. His last cry was lost in the sound of metal meeting stone. Margaret fell to her knees in the center of the room. The ceiling was beginning to sag, the heavy oak beams bowing under the weight of the shadows perched on the roof. She realized then that the forest and the ghosts didn't care about her. She was just another piece of the world that had failed them. If she stayed, she would be crushed along with the mercenaries and the machines. The only way to survive was to stop being the victim and become the conduit. She looked at the blue fire of the miners and the amber eyes of the animals outside, and she opened her mouth to scream. But what came out was the sound of the wind through the pines. She stood up, her movements no longer her own. She picked up a jagged shard of glass from the floor, the edge glowing with a faint, reflected blue light. With a steady hand, she drew the glass across her own forehead. The blood that welled up wasn't bright red. It was dark, almost black, and it smelled of wet earth. She let the drops fall into the yawning black pit in the floorboards. The response was immediate. A surge of cold air rushed up from the depths, a silent acknowledgement of the debt being paid. Margaret turned to the front door, which was hanging by a single hinge. She didn't open it. She tore it from the frame with a strength that made her bones ache. Outside, the world was a chaos of fog and teeth. She didn't run. She stepped out onto the porch and raised her arms, her voice joining the multi-tonal roar of the valley. She called to the shadows in the trees and the fire in the earth. She felt the human part of her, the part that felt fear, the part that felt debt, begin to dissolve, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The miners behind her stopped their work. They turned as one, their picks lowering. The blue fire in their eyes shifted, focusing on her as if she were the North Star. The animals at the edge of the yard began to move, a silent, furry tide flowing toward the remaining machines. Margaret felt the electricity of the forest humming through her veins. Her skin began to feel like bark. Her hair felt like dry, rustling leaves. She stepped off the porch, her bare feet hitting the mud. Where her skin touched the earth, black, thorny vines instantly erupted, spreading out like a web. They raced toward the bulldozers, wrapping around the steel tracks and the hydraulic lines. The machines groaned as the plants squeezed, the metal buckling like tin foil. Margaret didn't stop. She walked toward the edge of the woods, her figure becoming more translucent with every step, the fog wrapping around her like a shroud. Sheriff Miller was still there, slumped against his cruiser, his eyes vacant. He saw her coming and tried to reach for his gun, but his fingers were frozen. He watched as Margaret's face began to shift, the features blurring into the patterns of a lichen-covered stone. He dropped his badge into the mud and turned to run, but the forest wouldn't let him go. The path he had driven 1,000 times was gone, replaced by a wall of thorns that seemed to grow even as he looked at them. Margaret didn't look back at the house or the machines. She walked into the deepest part of the shadows, where the air was thickest with the scent of the old world. She felt her body losing its weight, her thoughts becoming the thoughts of the roots and the rain. She was no longer Margaret Calloway. She was the silence after the storm, the shadow in the hollow, the ghost in the mine. She disappeared into the white, swirling mist, leaving behind only a pair of empty boots on the porch and a valley that would never again belong to the world of men. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. The mining company's equipment lay in the mud, half submerged in the earth and covered in a layer of emerald green moss that seemed to have grown in minutes. The mercenaries were gone, their weapons already rusting in the damp air. The house stood empty, its doors and windows open to the forest, a hollow shell that the trees were already beginning to reclaim. High above, a red-tailed hawk circled the valley, its cry sharp and lonely in the still air. Below, in the shadows of the old mine entrance, a single pair of amber eyes flickered once and then vanished into the dark. The land was quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was waiting. Through the trees, a faint, rhythmic sound could be heard. The sound of a heart beating, slow and steady, deep within the stone of the mountain. The debt had been settled, and the forest was finally at peace.